Hello everyone, and welcome back for one more video in Chapter 4 of Human Physiology. So we have talked about 3 of the 4 types of tissue thus far. We need to finish off this discussion by talking a little bit about connective tissue, so let's get into it here. So connective tissue is not going to really have any one defining characteristic, certainly not like the other 3 types of tissue that we've talked about so far. So connective tissue is going to be kind of a hodgepodge of a number of different cells and structures with different characteristics. So we're going to have to just kind of look at them on a one-by-one basis. So one of the major features, though, if we had to ascribe any one particular characteristic to connective tissue as it opposes the other 3, is that there's not really a whole lot of cells. So epithelial tissue, that's all cells. Muscle tissue, nervous tissue, that's mostly cells. Connective tissue actually does not contain many cells. Most of connective tissue is actually made up of a substance called extracellular matrix. So extracellular matrix is a combination of interstitial fluid with a lot of fibrous proteins like collagen and keratin and things of that nature. So most of connective tissue does not actually contain any cells. Most of it is this extracellular matrix material. Extracellular matrix is synthesized and secreted by one particular type of cell within connective tissue called fibroblasts. You can see one in a picture right here. So this type of connective tissue, which is very common, it's the most common type of connective tissue that is this kind of hodgepodge of different types of cells and extracellular matrix, this is called connective tissue proper. So we can see several different types of connective tissue. The far left column is the connective tissue proper, which, as you can see here, comes in several different types. In addition, there's also supportive connective tissue, which is maybe what you're more familiar with in terms of making connections to bones themselves, and things of this nature. And then finally, we have the fluid connective tissues, the types that you probably didn't think of as tissues at all, blood and lymph. So aside from the connective tissue proper, we already said connective tissue can be fluid, in which you're talking about blood and lymph, or it can be a lot more solid in terms of being things like bone and cartilage and tendons and ligaments and things of that nature. So we've already said that there are not really that many cells, or certainly not a very high density of cells within connective tissue proper, but there are some cells for us to take note of. We've already talked about the fibroblasts, which make up the population of cells that are responsible for synthesizing and secreting the extracellular matrix. There are adipocytes, which are fat-storing cells, which come in brown and white varieties, which we will talk about a little bit later. There are mesenchymal cells, which are a type of multipotent stem cells that can divide and differentiate to replace any of these cells that are lost due to injury. And then finally, you have macrophages, which represent the immune system's presence within connective tissue. And these are types of immune cells that can enter the connective tissue from the bloodstream, a process called extravasation, which we can talk about much later on in the semester. So, in terms of the connective tissue proper, one of the types that we can talk about is called loose connective tissue. The first type of this is called adipose tissue. So adipose tissue, most of what we're dealing with here, we have kind of an unusually high density of cells for connective tissue. Most of the cells here are called adipocytes, and they come in a couple of different varieties. White adipose tissue is kind of what you think of fat as being. This is a whole collection of cells that store up fats that we can tap into later for ATP production if, say, we're on a diet and we're not really eating a whole lot of food. They also provide insulation from temperature changes, cushioning for kind of the rough nature of the lives that we lead. We kind of get roughed up here and there. Brown adipose tissue is actually hardly present at all in an adult human. Rather, you find these types of tissue a lot more in babies and infants that utilize the fats within brown adipose tissue for keeping warm rather than really making ATP. Areolar connective tissue is very similar to that picture of connective tissue proper that we looked at before. So this is a very common type of connective tissue. You'll find it underneath around the basal lamina of a lot of epithelial layers. So very common. And then reticular connective tissue is going to surround a lot of different soft organs. So it kind of forms a protein meshwork or framework that can attach to kind of the surrounding outside cells of organs like the liver, the spleen, etc. Dense connective tissue is going to tend to have a very high concentration of a lot of those protein fibers that we talked about in the connective tissue proper, namely collagen and elastin. So collagen has this tendency to stain pink in the types of histological sections in which we're looking at connective tissue, but do not make the mistake of thinking everything that's pink is collagen. That's not the case, but you can definitely appreciate that there is a lot of collagen within this type of dense connective tissue. So the presence of these protein fibers means that we're going to be dealing with a lot of tendons and ligaments and things that have a lot of structural strength and integrity, and we owe a lot of that to the protein fibers that we just talked about. So when we're talking about supportive connective tissue, we're really talking about cartilage and bone. So the cells that are found within cartilage, so cartilage is a perfectly good example of a connective tissue that contains hardly any cells, but the one type of cell that you will find within cartilage is called a chondrocyte. Chondrocytes secrete a collagenous matrix, so mainly collagen and a couple of other things embedded in it. Basically, the role of these chondrocytes is to secrete this collagenous matrix in preparation for forming bone. So part of the problem with cartilage is that it is avascular, meaning it has no access to a blood supply. So if you are, say, an athlete and have ever had a cartilage injury, you may have noticed that that injury was extremely slow to heal, because since there's no access to the blood supply, we can't really get oxygen and nutrients to those cells very easily, except through distant diffusion, which is going to be very slow. Hyaline that I was referencing earlier when I was talking about bone formation is made up at the ends of long bones like the femur and makes up your growth plate or epiphyseal plate that allows for the continued growth of the long bones leading into adulthood. Now, all of us probably listening to this lecture are well into adulthood. Our epiphyseal plates have closed, so this is kind of a moot discussion for us at this point. Bone, another type of supportive and very dense connective tissue, this is basically going to be somewhat similar to collagen. Basically what bone is it consists of the extracellular matrix of collagen fibers that were originally synthesized and secreted by chondrocytes, but they have accumulated and compacted a lot of mineralized ground substance, which causes it to harden and calcify and form the structure that you see below. One of those minerals is called hydroxyapatite, which is basically just a complex combination of both calcium and phosphate ions to form a very hard and rigid salt that accounts for the mineralization of bone. So, like cartilage, bone also contains embedded and living cells. These are called osteocytes, and these are embedded within regions of the bone called lacunae. These osteocytes, among other types that we could talk about at a later date, come in two major varieties, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts, as we will eventually find out, contribute to the formation and deposition of calcium and maturation of bone, whereas osteoclasts do the opposite. They dissolve bone and break down bone to raise calcium levels in the blood. So the relative activity of osteoplasts and osteoclasts in terms of homeostasis is going to come down to what are the levels of calcium in the bone. And we will definitely have a conversation on that at a later date. Bone, as opposed to cartilage, is actually highly vascularized. So you can actually see, actually it's a little hard to see, but you can actually see some capillaries making their way through this cross-section of the bone. So the bone cells do have good access to the blood supply, so any bone injuries should heal relatively quickly. I mean, of course, considering that bone injuries tend to be very bad, they're still going to take a little time to heal, but they will heal a lot faster than they would ordinarily if they did not have a good blood supply access. And then finally, one of our last discussions we can have is on fluid connective tissue, being the blood and the lymph. Now, we've talked about blood before as a type of extracellular fluid. We're going to talk about it a lot more when we get into the cardiovascular unit. So we're not going to belabor any particular point here, but blood and lymph are good examples of a fluid liquid extracellular matrix. That's your extracellular fluid, that's your blood plasma, and then any cells you find make up what we call the formed elements. We talked about that before when you perform a hematocrit, right? So for blood, these formed elements are the various cells that circulate about, being red blood cells, platelets, and all the different white blood cells. And then the very last thing that we can go ahead and mention is that any particular organ, whether it's the heart, the brain, the liver, etc., an organ is going to have at least 2 different types of tissue. So no organ is going to be made up of just one type of tissue. So your brain is going to be nervous tissue and connective tissue. Your heart is going to be muscle tissue and connective tissue. So connective tissue is going to be all over the place. But organs are characterized as having at least 2 different types of tissue. So heart and blood vessels are muscle and epithelia and some connective tissue. The skin is your one shining example as an organ that has just so happens to be all 4 different types of tissue all at once. So the skin has layers of epithelia for protection, subcutaneous adipose tissue for insulation from temperature changes, nervous tissue for sensing things like touch and temperature and things of that nature, and muscle fibers to allow our hairs to stand on end when we get goosebumps. That's called piloerection. All right, so that is going to do it for Chapter 4. So once again, I congratulate you on making it through another week. So we will go ahead and sign off here. Next time, when we pick things back up, we are going to really get after some hot and heavy physiology, and we are going to start talking about communication in the body. So